Lord, the company's policy prohibits unauthorized badges. That thing has to be removed now, said the store employee. A young man who barely left adolescence with a grimace of contempt, his fingers, in fact, extending and pulling the only entangled metal pin in the worn John Mac McTavish jacket. Mac, 78, backed his hand, flying instinctively to protect the Purple Heart. His only visible metal, a crude reminder of one day that he would prefer to forget, but that felt forced to honor. This is not one thing, son, Mac growled, his low and dangerous voice. He won. The employee, emboldened, started the fabric metal with a sudden pull. The rules are the rules old. 5 minutes later, while Mac was trembling outside, a shadow fell on him. The employee, an imposing figure with army gala uniform, stars shining on his shoulders, filled the threshold. "He has just assaulted my father," said the officer, his voice like ice. "If you think some symbols are, sacred and family honor is absolute. Right, never forget below." John Mac McTavish was a man carved in granite and guts. His life had been a service. 2 service periods in Vietnam as Marina. A life lived according to the code of honor that seemed increasingly alien in the modern world. Now, at 78, his shoulders were a little more curled. His walk slowed by old shrapnel wounds that hurt with each climate change, but his eyes still retained the resolution, unwavering of a man who had faced death and had lived to tell it, although he rarely did. He lived alone in a small apartment subsidized by the government. His quiet days splashed by visits to the clinic of veterans and lonely walks. His most precious possession, rarely used but always close, was the Purple Heart he had received after being injured while dragging his squad sergeant to a safe place under intense fire. It was not a symbol of heroism for him, but survival, of sacrifice, of ties forged in the crucible of combat. Today was the anniversary of that battle. As he had every year, Mac turned on the real metal, not a tape, but the distinctive with heart-shaped decoration in the flap of his old TDD beach, clean but undeniably staved. It was a private act. I needed a new pair of resistant shoes to walk. The old man had finally gone to a better life. He went to Food Locker Emporium, a large shoe chain, in the center shopping center, hoping to find something affordable and durable. He didn't look for problems, just a couple of decent shoes to relieve pain in his feet. The Emporium Food Locker was brilliant, noisy, and attended by adolescents and young adults who seemed more interested in their phones than in customers. Mac finally found a pair of walking shoes sensible of his size and went to the cashier. The employee on duty was a young man named Chad, just 20 years old, with a boring expression, a label with its crooked name, and an air of deep indifference. Chad scanned his shoes. He announced the price and waited drumming with his fingers at the counter, his gaze traveling with disdain the old Mac jacket and the only somewhat tangled metal he had been on. "They will be $695, Chad said with a monochrome voice. Mac nodded, looking for his wallet. While doing it, Chad's eyes looked at the Purple Heart with a look of incipient authority out of place. "Hey, wait a second, grandfather," said Chad, his tone by changing from boredom to offices. "What is that brilliant thing in your jacket?" Mac made a surprised pause. "It is a Purple Heart, son." Chad snorted. "A what?" "It looks like a kind of cheap pen. The store's policy knows that employees cannot use unauthorized buttons or badges. I suppose that also applies to customers trying to make a statement. We have to maintain a certain image here, do you know? Professional." Mac stayed, embarrassed. "This is not a statement, young. It is a military decoration of the United States. I won it." "Yes, yes, he won it in the Great War of the Toy Soldiers, right?" Chad mocked, clearly enjoying what he perceived as a demonstration of power. "Look, I don't care anything. It looks in bad taste. The company's policy tries to maintain a clean and orderly appearance. That thing violates the spirit of our standards of the clothing code for a family environment. You have to take it away now." In fact, he extended his hand above the counter, his fingers making a movement deep in Clisco to Mac's chest. Mac instinctively retreated, his hand flying to cover the metal. "This will not touch," said his voice, going down to a low and dangerous growl that had once made tan. start understanding. Chad, however, was not a tan soldier. He was a young and arrogant employee who saw an old man who could intimidate. He confused the protective gesture and the low gross of Mac with weakness or belligerence. "Oh, we are putting fighters, grandfather," Chad mocked, emboldened by his perceived authority and the lack of immediate supervision. "Look, I told her to take her away. It is a distraction. It is probably a false thing anyway." Before Mac could react more, before he could process the audacity, Chad leaned more on the counter, his quick and surprisingly aggressive movements. He grabbed the purple heart, and with a sharp and vicious pull, he ripped it from the Mac jacket fabric. The brooch scratched a small hole. The metal fell crazy on the counter. "Go, a problem solved," Chad said with a triumphant smile, throwing the metal towards Mac as if it were a piece of garbage. "Now you'll turn off these shoes, or are you going to stand there? Seems stupid." Mac looked at the metal that lay at the counter, then the torn fabric of his jacket, then the mocking face of the employee. A red fog of fury, an emotion that had not felt so intense in decades, arose inside him. His hands closed in fists. Years of combat training cried out for a physical response, but years of discipline won with effort, and the deep tiredness of age contained it. I was trembling, not fear, but of a deep and heartbreaking anger and a deep feeling of rape. Other nearby clients had stopped to look, some with surprise, others with nerve fun. No one intervened. No manager appeared. Ma slowly extended his trembling hand and picked up his purple heart. He did not look at Chad again. He turned without the shoes, without saying a word, and left Food Locker Emporium, the tangled flap of his jacket as a burning testimony of the insult he had just endured. He went out to the shopping center, found a quiet bank, and left. Falling into it, his broken breathing. The physical assault on the metal was felt as an assault on his own soul, to the memory of each fallen comrade. Sitting at the bank trying to calm the storm that roared inside it, Mac gropes his phone. His first instinct was to call the police, denounce the aggression, the robbery, even if it was temporary, of his metal. But what would they do? Find out a young punk for being an idiot and respectful felt inappropriate. Then he remembered his son, his boy David. David there was, followed by his father's footsteps, but had arrived much higher. David, who is now Colonel David MacTav, destined in Fort Hamilton, just 1 hour by car. They were not particularly close. Years of Mac's own stoic silence and David's demanding career. They had created a respectful distance, but they were blood. And David, Mac, knew. I understood the meaning of that medal in a way that few others could. He found David's number. His son responded to the second Temuno, his clear and professional voice. "Colonel MacTavish." "David," Mac said, his own still trembling voice. "I am Dad." There was a frictional pause. Then David's tone softened. "Dad, are you okay? You sound weird." Mac, with the tense voice for the emotion, the incident reported. The shoe store, the arrogant employee, the mockery, and then the physical act that the metal of the jacket will tear him out. He did not adorn. He did not dramatize. He didn't need it. The facts were sufficiently condemnatory. He called David a thing. It started it as if it were garbage. Silence on the other side. Heavy and loaded silence. Then, "Dad, what Food Locker? What shopping center? Are you still there?" "Northwood Mall," said Mac. "Food Locker Emporium. I am in a right bank outside your main entrance. It happened about 5 or 6 minutes ago." "Stay there, Dad," said Colonel MacTavish, his voice now devoid of any warmth, replaced by a cold and sharp edge like a razor. "Do not move. Do not interact with anyone. I am on my way, and I am not alone." The line was cut. Max reclined, a wave of exhaustion. He invaded him. I didn't know what David said with "I'm not alone," but he knew his son. When David MacTavish said he was going, he was going. And when his voice had that particular tone, he usually meant someone was about to have a very bad day. Less than 15 minutes later, a testimony of the urgency and perhaps the speed of a military vehicle not too worried about civil traffic laws. The main entrance of the Emporium Food Locker was filled suddenly and very impressively, not by a single child. angry, but by Colonel David McTavish in his Army Gala uniform, complete and immaculate. Class A, relighting brass, rows of ribbons that witnessed their own distinguished career, prominent Colonel Eagles on their shoulders, and flanking it, rigidly standing in firm position, there were two sergeants equally imposing masters, also in full gala uniform, their expressions as granite. The trio did not walk. They marched to the store, their polished boots echoing on the floor of tiles, its combined presence radiating an aura of absolute and unnegotiable authority that silenced pop music and stopped dry buyers. Chad, the employee, was back in his cash register, joking with another employee, his previous triumph still evident. He looked up with a sudden silence and saw the three uniformed soldiers directing him directly to him. His jaw fell. His face passed from conceited to terrified in a nanosecond. Colonel McTavish stopped directly, in front of the chat cash register. He did not speak immediately. He only stared at him, his cold and hard eyes a silent and powerful condemnation. The two sergeants stood slightly behind him, their equally inflexible looks effectively cornering Chad. "You," said Colonel McTavish, his low, controlled voice, but with the unmistakable weight of the command. "He is the employee who approached an old gentleman and took him by force a military decoration of the States, united a Purple Heart of his person approximately 20 minutes ago." It was not a question, it was a declaration of facts. Chad could only nod mute, trembling visibly. "My father," the colonel continued, his voice going down even more, becoming even more dangerous. "Sergeant Major John McTavish, Marines Corps of the United States, retired. A man who bleeding for this country when you were probably still in diapers." The store manager, a nervous man named Henderson who had been alerted by another personnel about the sudden arrival of an army general and his bodyguards, ran to them, twisting his hands. "Colonel, sir, I'm very sorry. There must be some terrible misunderstanding. I had no idea." Colonel McTavish interrupted him with a look that could freeze the fire. "There is no misunderstanding, Henderson Lords. There is only one act of deep lack of respect and, frankly, aggression, perpetrated by his employee in his store against a veteran of combat with decoration." And my father turned his gaze towards Chad, who seemed ready to flee. That thing that started his chest means that he shed his blood at the service of this nation. It is not jewelry. It is not a Malgusto pin. It is a sacred symbol of sacrifice, and you desecrated it and deepened it. The colonel pauses, letting his words weigh in the air. The whole store was now silent, all the eyes put in the confrontation at the cashier. "He will apologize to my father," Colonel McTavish said, his voice as ice, chopped. "And then, Mr. Henderson, he will explain in a lot of detail what disciplinary measures will take against this employee and what corrective training will receive all his staff to ensure that no veteran, no citizen is ever treated with so much contempt in his establishment again." Just then, Mac, who had been discreetly indicated by one of the sergeant teachers, slowly entered the store. His Purple Heart, now carefully caught again in his torn flap, stopped next to his son Chad, under the combined and implacable gaze of the colonel. The two sergeants and now his victim finally found his voice, a pathetic shriek. I'm sorry, Lord, I didn't know. I was wrong." Colonel McTavish simply looked at him until Chad looked directly at Mac and repeated his apology, this time with an appearance of sincerity born of the pure terror. "Well," Colonel Seck said. Then he went to the manager. "Mr. Henderson, my father came here to buy a couple of shoes, I trust, in which they will now be free together with a life discount in all Food Locker Emporium locations for him as a small sample of the deep regret of his store." Henderson nodded vigorously. "Absolutely, Colonel. Of course, anything." Colonel Lugor put a hand on his father's shoulder. "Dad, let's look for those shoes and then lead you to eat the best steak in the city." While they walked to the shoe halls, leaving behind a devastated employee and, to a frantically appeased manager, the two sergeant teachers remained in the counter, their expressions ensuring that they would not occur more misunderstandings. The consequences were quick. Chat was, in fact, fired in the spot by a corporate directive that arrived after a very brief and very intense phone call that Henderson made to his regional manager, probably motivated by the undeclared threat, but clearly implicit, of a public relations nightmare that, He involved the lack of respect for veterans from a national chain with a colonel as a witness. The corporate office of Food Locker Emporium issued a public apology and announced a training initiative on respect and recognition to veterans throughout the company. Mac won his free new shoes and several pairs more insisted by his son. The steak dinner was excellent. More importantly, for the first time in a long time, Mac felt seen, truly seen and defended. His son, the colonel, had not only defended him, had mobilized. He had exercised the quiet and uniform authority of the uniform against a petty act of malice. When leaving the mall, David accompanied his father to his car. "Dad," he said, "you should never have had to endure that. No one should. That medal touched its own ribbons. It means something. It means everything for those who understand." Mecca nodded with his eyes. "Thank you, son." "You didn't have to do, Dad." David interrupted gently, his previous triumph still evident. He looked up with a sudden silence and saw the three uniformed soldiers directing him directly to him. His jaw fell. His face passed from conceited to terrified in a nanosecond. Colonel McTavish stopped directly, in front of the chat cash register. He did not speak immediately. He only stared at him, his cold and hard eyes a silent and powerful condemnation. The two sergeants stood slightly behind him, their equally inflexible looks effectively cornering Chad. "You," said Colonel McTavish, his low, controlled voice, but with the unmistakable weight of the command. "He is the employee who approached an old gentleman and took him by force a military decoration of the States, United a Purple Heart of his person approximately 20 minutes ago." It was not a question, it was a declaration of facts. Chad could only nod mute, trembling visibly. "My father," the colonel continued, his voice going down even more, becoming even more dangerous. "Sergeant Major John McTavish, Marines Corps of the United States, retired. A man who bleeding for this country when you were probably still in diapers." The store manager, a nervous man named Henderson who had been alerted by another personnel about the sudden arrival of an army general and his bodyguards, ran to them, twisting his hands.